evening, folks. I'm coming live to you today from Busboys and Poets, 14th and B Street. Let's hear it for the folks in the room. All right. We are here for a very special presentation of Busboys and Poets Books Present, because we've actually got, I'm not going to call him a local hero or anything, but there's a reason why there's so many folks here with us today. So, without further ado, we're going to get this program started. For you folks joining in with us at home, you can actually order Busboys and Poets online for pickup or to go and use SOJO as a promo code and get 10% off. So put in that order, join us for dinner tonight, and all right, we're going to get started with a quick video, and then we'll follow up with an introduction from Busboys and Poets owner, Andy Shallal.
We are at a pivotal crossroads. The soul of our nation is infected with a form of polarization that has turned increasingly toxic. This polarization profoundly impacts our politics, our personal lives, our communities, and it's even seeped into our churches and houses of worship. So what is the cure? We need a bigger story of us. We need to celebrate the beauty and promise of America's ideals. We also need to confront and make amends for the ways in which we have fallen woefully short of realizing those ideals. We need a moral vision capable of inspiring and uniting the vast majority of Americans. We need a more perfect union. And the only way we'll get there is by co-creating a more just and inclusive America. I'm an American. I'm the son of a black mother and a white father. I'm a social justice advocate and a bridge builder. I'm the president of Sojourners. I'm a reverend. I'm the proud father of 2 black boys. And I'm a prisoner of hope. I believe there's a way out of the fear and hatred that divides our country and our world. I believe there's a way to fulfill our founding fathers' promise of a more perfect union, a way forward that taps into the best of our civic and our religious values. Quite simply, we must resurrect the concept of the beloved community. In the beloved community, everyone is valued and everyone can thrive. In the beloved community, neither punishment nor privilege is tied to race or ethnicity. Neither punishment nor privilege is tied to gender or ableness. Neither punishment nor privilege is tied to sexual orientation or gender identity. But the beloved community faces significant obstacles and seemingly unbreakable barriers, partly because we have such conflicting and competing understandings of our nation's history, partly because the injustices of the past continue to show up in the present. I wrote this book for my boys because their generation will inherit these challenges. But I also wrote it for each and every one of you. That started me on.
So unfortunately, folks, the folks at home got to view the video, but we're going to save it for you guys later. We'll play it later. If we could actually have Andy Shallal please come up to the stage.
Hello everyone, welcome again to Busboys and Poets. It's great to have all of you here. It's wonderful to have events in person. I hope everyone is vaxxed and ready to interact with other people. I hope we spread love and community and not COVID tonight. So please be mindful of the people around you, and we have some hand sanitizer there if you'd like to use it. It's a real pleasure here to have Adam and also Jim Wallace, of course, being here with us tonight. When I read the title of the book, A More Perfect Union, I thought, well, it's really interesting. I, as an immigrant, came to this country looking for that perfect place because a lot of us who are from outside this country, we come to this country thinking this is going to be the most amazing place ever on earth because that's what you hear about. You hear about the America that is possible. And we end up coming here and inevitably get disappointed. My family arrived in this country in 1966. It wasn't until 1967 that a black person, a white person, was able to marry in the state of Virginia where we lived. So it was very shocking and eye-opening to see that this union is not so perfect, that there's so many things that need to happen still in order for it to move in that direction. A lot has changed since then, of course, but we take a few steps back, a few steps forward, a few steps back, a few steps forward, and we continue striving toward that perfect union. So it's really exciting to have Adam, who was telling me the story about how he came about to write about this, about the last election, and how it was so divisive. I still don't know how we can bring people together. It sounds like a lofty idea that he has of how we can bring people together. I'm not sure I'm convinced that this is actually possible at this moment in time. But again, hope is something that we all have to have in order for us to survive and be able to stay together as a community. So thank you all for being here. It's a pleasure to have, oh, there you are. You guys behind me. Thinking, where are they? I can't see them. They're there. So Adam Taylor and Emira Woods. Emira is a wonderful friend, someone that I've known for many, many years. I'm so excited that she's going to be doing the interview for a couple of reasons. One, she has the most amazing outfits. I've never seen her in the same outfit twice. So that's really, and it matches, look, it matches the chair. All right, did you plan that? I guess you did, of course you did. So it's really exciting to have her here. And of course, Adam as well. Thank you so much for being here. And I look forward to the Q&A afterwards. Thank you. See you, the microphone is lower next to you.
I'm going to stand up for just the first one. Well, first of all, thank you, Andy, and thank you, Busboys and Poets, for hosting me here for this book celebration and event. It is really fitting and kind of coming full circle that I am back here. It was about 10 years ago that I had a chance to launch my first book, Mobilizing Hope, which kind of feels like in a different lifetime now. But I cannot think of a more fitting place, both because of the ethos and ethic of Busboys, and that's in large part because of Andy's vision and his business ethic, but also because of this cloud of witnesses that is literally on these walls. These leaders that you see on the wall really paved the way for the ongoing work of building a beloved community that we're going to talk about tonight. So I'm just so grateful for their incredible witness and for all the ways in which they've inspired me. I'm grateful to Emira, who's going to have a chance to interview me in a second. I just wanted to share a little bit of an overview of the book and share a couple of readings from the book, and then we'll pretty quickly get into a conversation and we'll kind of take it from there. And I'm anxious to be in a conversation with all of you. Before I do that, though, I do have to say a couple of thank yous. I know I'm not going to cover everyone in this room as much as I'd like to. First and foremost, I need to thank my wife, Cherie. This book would not have been written without her selfless love. And so thank you, my dear, for all that you sacrificed to make this book possible. I also want to thank all of the staff of Sojourners, the founder of Sojourners. Jim is in the back. And I'm being told I should sit.
Yes, you take the mic.
Okay. All right, we're going to do some more informal style. That won't be my preaching Baptist self. So I also want to thank Dr. Barbara Williams Skinner and Ms. Constance Nguyen, two of our dear partners and friends. And a special thank you to all of our partners that are here. I'm not going to name you all, friends, as well as so many others that have been a part of my journey. I mentioned in the acknowledgments that it truly does take a village to create a book. I know it also needs a village to raise a child, but in my case, it took a village to be able to bring this book to fruition. So I want to share a little bit about why I wrote this book, what I ultimately hope the book will do, or what it can kind of catalyze in our nation, particularly in this very pivotal moment that we are in, let alone what it might do for the entire world. I know those are big, hopeful aspirations, but I am hoping that this can be a pretty big book to meet this really, really pivotal moment we're in. We the people, to form a more perfect union. Those are the iconic words that frame the preamble of the Constitution. And I have to admit, I didn't know the full backstory around how those words were written. I've become a huge Hamilton fan. I don't think any Hamilton fans in the house. One of the kind of unsung founding fathers. There's another one who actually coined and penned the words "a more perfect union," named Gouverneur Morris. How many have heard of him? Okay, a couple. Got some historians in the house. Gouverneur Morris was 35 years old at the time. He was a part of the Constitutional Convention about 244 years ago, to be exact, as of last week. And he was a part of the committee of style that literally helped to create those iconic words. And we know that the we part of that phrase has always been contested in terms of who is included in the we, who gets extended the full promise of America, particularly the promise tied into the American creed of liberty and justice for all. A More Perfect Union was the title I chose for this book, and the emphasis, as you can see on the cover, is on the more. Because the beauty and the brilliance of America is not in our supposed perfectionism. It is in the constant striving to ensure that we can actually live up to the ideals that this nation was founded on. My son was here earlier. Hopefully some of you had a chance to meet both my sons. My older son, Joshua, played a big role in inspiring this book. And if we can all kind of jump in a time capsule in our minds and go back to the morning after the election in 2016. Now, some of you may not want to go there in your head and in your heart, but just for a second, go back with me. In my household, my wife and I couldn't sleep that night. We had come back from a kind of election watching party that turned into a funeral. It was actually at the Wallace's house, to be honest. And my 5-year-old son at the time, Joshua, who's now 10, literally came into our room with this very distraught look on his face. He said, "Mommy and Daddy, I really need to know who won." And we had tried to shield him from the election, which is kind of impossible in Washington, D.C. in particular. And we were trying to make sense of it ourselves, and we were like, "Well, we think Mr. Trump won." And his exact response was, "I don't understand how someone who has said and done such mean things can win." And those of you who know me, I'm not typically speechless, but I just really was speechless in that moment. I didn't know how to explain to him, or even to myself, how that happened. And it's not because a Republican won, or someone who's more conservative than I am won. It's because a person who has kind of proven himself over and over again to be a narcissist and amoral was able to stoke and appeal to many of the worst impulses of our country in order to win, particularly appealing to the original sin of racism, to misogyny and xenophobia. And so I was trying to grapple with this, and I felt like I failed in that moment. And my son, Joshua, knew or could tell just how much in turmoil I was. And he reassuringly replied to us and said, "It's okay though, because you and Mommy are going to make it okay." I'm not sure we've completely succeeded in that, but I did take that responsibility seriously. And I knew in my spirit and my heart that I couldn't stay in the current job that I was in. I was doing meaningful work at the World Bank, leading what's called Faith Initiative. And that really accelerated a journey for me to rejoin Sojourners as the executive director, and then this last November, I had the privilege of becoming president of the organization. And I think part of the reason I wrote this book is to really try to unpack for myself, and also for, in particular, my kids' generation, how this happened, and even more importantly, how we could prevent it from happening again. And I came to the conclusion pretty quickly that one of the reasons this happened, not the only one, is that then candidate Trump was able to spin a narrative, a very dystopian and pernicious narrative, that appealed to a large segment of the country that kind of tapped into a lot of their sense of grievance, of feeling dislocated and left out, and it again appealed to some of the worst instincts of racism, etc. It was the Make America Great Again narrative, I would call it fallacy. And yet it was quite effective. And I come from a kind of organizing background and advocacy background, believe in the power of what's called public narrative, to be able to inspire people to think differently, to act differently, to inspire people to hope differently. And I believe that only a more hopeful and unifying narrative can overcome a distorted and pernicious one. And I don't think we had that kind of countervailing narrative in 2016. And I'm not just talking about coming from Democrats or Senator Clinton, who's running against Trump. I'm talking about from the broader civil society that so many of us are a part of, including the church and religious institutions, where I believe this need for a moral vision and ability to communicate one is most profound. Another quick story. So a couple years ago, I had the privilege to start teaching. And I became an adjunct professor at Pepperdine. No, I don't get to teach in Malibu, California as much as I would like to. I'm here in DC. And I get to teach some really bright students, some of the brightest in the country. And the course is on religion and comparative politics. And in the course, I teach a class that's focused on the myths that have shaped the DNA of this country. Sometimes we very much take it for granted that they are woven into the subconscious of our country. They include the myth that we're a chosen nation, that very much ties into American exceptionalism. The myth that we're a Christian nation. We actually were founded intentionally so, based on the separation of church and state and based on religious pluralism. The myth that we are an innocent nation, that we can do no harm. And then, of course, the kind of primary myth of white supremacy, this belief in a hierarchy of human value that literally was enshrined in the Constitution of the United States, essentially saying that slaves, black slaves, were three-fifths of a human being. And so, as I teach about these myths, I also talk about these key moments in our history that have very much shaped who we are, shaped our history, our character, etc. And I am kind of taken aback about how few students know these pivotal moments in our history. Maya Angelou once said that we can't know where we're going unless we know where we've been. And James Baldwin said, those who refuse to acknowledge their history remain captive to it. And so I teach about the period of Reconstruction and what led to the demise of Reconstruction. I teach about the Southern strategy and how much that's influenced our current politics, including kind of fueling the mass incarceration surge that we are still living with today. I teach about the origins of the religious right that many people confuse or think was because of abortion, when it was really about opposing the desegregation of Christian colleges, including Boston University. I teach about the Chinese Immigration Act and a whole series of things across our history. And the reason why that's so important is we can't know where we're going again unless we know where we've been. And one of the reasons why I think we're so divided as a country is because we have such competing and conflicting understandings of our history and such denial about our history continues to show up in the present. I want to read just really quickly one quick passage that tries to illustrate this. This is the introduction. I write, until we have a better common understanding of our nation's history, including the myths and contradictions that have shaped it, and unless we can unite around a shared moral vision for our future, we will continue to retreat into partisan and cultural camps. We will fail to forge common ground that bridges our differences and advances the common good. We must craft a new common story for our nation. So, I grew up very much in the shadow of the civil rights movement. I don't know if there's any other Generation Xers in here. I won't age you, but I'm a proud member of Generation X. And my parents, someone, I think actually Andy mentioned the 1967 Supreme Court case, Loving versus City of Virginia, which legalized interracial marriage in the country. Well, that case was particularly important for me because it enabled, in some ways, for my parents to marry each other. In 1968, they made the controversial decision to marry. My mother's black, my father's white. And they instilled in me a deep and abiding belief that my diversity as a biracial black man, but also, in some ways even more importantly, the rich diversity of our country, cultural, racial, and otherwise, is a gift and an asset, not a weakness and not something to be feared. One of the underlying fault lines and narratives that I think is very much shaping our politics, not just in 2016, but also in 2020, is this question about whether we will truly embrace the multiracial democracy that we are becoming and in many ways have become. And there is a part of the country that has been taught and has been inspired to fear and feel trepidation toward that change in reality, and others that embrace it wholeheartedly and can see how that is going to benefit all of us. Well, I really felt and feel that the moral vision of the beloved community, which was literally the vision that animated the civil rights struggle, has the greatest potential to unite so many of the disparate parts of this country across generations, across races, across cultural traditions, across many other things that divide us and define us. And that if reimagined and redefined in more contemporary language, is what I try to do in this book, I believe that it would have the power not just to heal some of our deepest wounds, but also enable us to unite around a shared moral vision that could help us transform our nation. Dr. King, in his final book, which was entitled, Where Do We Go From Here?, asked a very prescient question. He asked, where do we go from here? Chaos or community? And my remix, 21st century or 2021, if you will, version of that question is, where do we go from here? Toxic polarization or the beloved community? We are arguably as divided, if not more divided, as a nation than we were in the 1960s. At the height of when so much controversy was sparked around the kind of civil rights gains that were won as a result of the civil rights movement, in addition to the Vietnam War and other sources. And the reason I use the word toxic is we've reached a point not just where we distrust and dislike the people that are on the other political side than ourselves. Polling shows that we have grown to hate them, to literally want to defeat them. Now, I'm a part of a faith tradition, a Christian faith tradition, that calls on me to love my enemies. It reminds me that only perfect love can cast out fear. And while that's a very high bar, I believe that that is critical for part of what we need as an antidote to toxic polarization. The moral vision of the beloved community is tied to this sense of a kind of redemptive vision. Dr. King, after the Montgomery bus boycott victory, said that the end goal is reconciliation. The end goal is redemption. The end goal is the beloved community. I try to build on Dr. King's words and also the inspiring words of Ella Baker and Fannie Hamer and Bob Moses and so many other leaders. But in my own kind of contemporary version of the beloved community, my most succinct definition is building a society, building a community where everyone can be seen, everyone is heard, everyone is respected, and most importantly, everyone can thrive. And put in more kind of policy terms, it is building a society where neither punishment nor privilege is tied to race, to ethnicity, to gender, to ableness, to sexual orientation, or to gender identity. Now I know that is a big vision, that's a high bar. But I actually think it is a vision that is rooted in the very promises of our Constitution. It's rooted in our best civic values, and it's rooted in our best religious values. I believe that the beloved community vision could be such a powerful one, partly because it hasn't been already co-opted or miscaricatured by any particular side, partly because it has arms wide enough to embrace all of America, including dreamers and including those who come from more conservative persuasions. I believe that it is a vision that brings together some of the best of a more conservative emphasis on community and responsibility with a more progressive emphasis on dignity and human rights. And so this book is my attempt, at least, to really unpack what the beloved community means for us today. And I do that in part 3 through what I describe as the 6 Beatitudes of building a beloved community. So they're drawing from, building on the Sermon on the Mount and Jesus' most powerful sermon, in my opinion, where he outlines the real Beatitudes. My Beatitudes are the set of commitments that will help us realize the beloved community in our world today, in our nation today. They include what I describe as a Imago Dei commitment to equality. It includes a commitment to radical welcome, which we desperately need, particularly after the parliamentarian decided that it was not going to be permissible to include a pathway to citizenship in the reconciliation package, literally over the weekend. It includes a commitment to environmental stewardship, which we know is so desperately needed as we continue to see the ravages of climate change and our climate crisis all around the country and around the world. It includes a commitment to dignity for all, which is at the very heart of the UN Declaration of Human Rights and at the heart of what's called the Sustainable Development Goal agenda. It includes, and this is where I want to end, a commitment to Ubuntu interdependence, which actually may be the beatitude that we most desperately need right now. In the pitched battle over whether it should be mandated to wear masks and the mandate to get vaccines, we are seeing some of the worst of American individualism come out. We have made personal liberty into an idol. And I believe part of the antidote to that is a greater understanding and commitment to our interdependence, to an Ubuntu interdependence, which essentially is tied into the African philosophy that I am because we are. It is tied into the Zulu greeting of Sabona, which means I see you, my sister, or my brother. And the response is Siakona, I am seen. In other words, my full humanity cannot be experienced unless you affirm it, and you see my humanity. And put in religious terms, you see my divinity. I would love to go into a lot more detail about these different Beatitudes. I provide a lot of policy prescriptions in these chapters, and I give glimpses of the beloved community. But I want to close just by reading a quick excerpt from the conclusion. And then I am going to turn it over to my beloved sister, Emira. So, I write in the epilogue, beloved community does not start or end with our politics, but transforming our broken politics is an indispensable part of how we must co-create it. A shared moral vision of the beloved community will not be a panacea to cure our nation's ills, but it will help provide an essential treatment program. And while we may be hardwired for division and polarization, it is also ingrained in us to yearn and strive for justice and community. This journey of building the beloved community will be a hard one, requiring sacrifice, vigilance, and courage. But it will not be defined purely around struggle. The pursuit of the beloved community will also be filled with great joy, and in it we will find deeper purpose, belonging, and meaning. That's why it's worth pursuing, because the fruits of human flourishing, right relationship, and thriving communities are unlocked and experienced in the very act of building the beloved community itself.
Powerful, profound, visionary. We are here to celebrate that joy that Adam so beautifully talks and writes about. The joy in the pursuit of the beloved community, Adam. That's what we're doing here tonight. We're kicking off that joy. So please, first of all, join me in congratulating Adam. You can find through Busboys and Poets ways to get this book. And I would say, holiday is coming up. Get several copies. These should be your gifts.
Make sure you buy it from independent bookstores.
Independent bookstores, including Busboys and Poets. I hope everyone online hears that. With a discount for the independent bookstores, especially Busboys and Poets. But we are here, I have to say, for a few reasons. First, Adam and his brilliance. Cherie in her brilliance. Would you please stand up? And thank you for making this book happen. Adam said it, but those of us who know, we know. The wind beneath the wings, and we thank you for your steadfast commitment, not only to your family, but to our world. Thank you, Cherie. And we have to also take a minute, Adam, to say thank you to Andy, because we are here for a reason. This isn't just Andy's book launch. This is the book launch at Busboys and Poets, right? Andy, Shallal, you have, I believe, created this notion of a beloved community right here in DC. And now we have to say Baltimore, the newest location of Busboys and Poets. But building communities, as many of you know, from the art that he has so beautifully created on the wall, bringing in all of the activists from throughout history that have inspired us, to all that he continues to do with business leaders that are seizing their power to bring change, to demand the right for people, fight for 15, and so many other struggles for dignity. So we thank you, Andy, for your vision, for the community that you've built, and we're honored to be a part of it and to watch it grow. So here for Busboys and Poets. And we have to also thank all of you in this room are phenomenal leaders. I'm looking at Dr. Newman because she's one of our leaders. And many of you in this room, Mark Harrison, you have been phenomenal in building community around policy, around community, around change. So I feel like I'm a friend of Adam's, and that's what brought us all here. But in this room, people like Jim Wallace, it's like your legacy is profound. And we thank you for inspiring us. We thank you for making the choice to get us to where we are today. So, with all that said now, I'm meant to be sort of interviewing Adam, and I want to encourage everyone both in the room and joining us virtually, get your questions ready, because this is going to be like an informal conversation among friends, right? I'm going to kick it off, and then we're going to ask you for your questions and comments and thrills about the book, and then we'll go to those who are joining us virtually to kind of get their input as well. So we ask you to tweet, to make sure you use all the hashtags for Sojourners and for Adam and for Busboys, and to get into the conversation, both those in the room and those joining virtually. So Adam, let me kick it off a bit. You are, I feel like I first met you in your days as a global leader on global AIDS, right? You were the founder of the Student Global AIDS Campaign, and I was honored, I think, to be on the board of Global Justice way back in the day. But you have long been a visionary, acting, thinking where you are in the space where you are, but also thinking global. So I guess I just wanted to hear, in this midst of COVID and all that we have gone through the last year and a half as a beloved community, how you see this moment and the need for a more perfect union in this context of so much pain, generational trauma, and real loss, right? Loss of lives, loss of livelihoods. So situate this book in this context of where we are now, both in the US and globally, with regard to global health.
Beautiful question. So, one of the things that's kind of crazy to reflect on, I wrote a big chunk of the draft, probably the majority of it, before the COVID pandemic even was a thing, even before it started to impact and devastate so many communities across this country and around the world. And pretty soon after COVID struck, I was reflecting because I was celebrating my 20-year anniversary in ministry. So my beloved sister, Zina Jacques, is here. She was with me way back in the day at Union Baptist Church when I got in front of that pulpit and gave my initial sermon. And then literally, the title of my sermon 20 years ago was Healing the Body. And I was preaching from Paul's letter to the church in Pergamum. It's one of my favorite passages in all Scripture, actually. And in it, the Apostle Paul speaks to a church that is riddled with division, riddled with many people that are very much co-opted by a culture that's very hedonistic and materialistic. And there's a lot of parallels between the Caribbean church, unfortunately, and where we are today. But in this text, Apostle Paul provides some timeless wisdom for how we can overcome division and polarization. And ultimately, wisdom that I drew upon as we look at the crisis of the HIV and AIDS pandemic. But I think it's just as relevant for the COVID pandemic. And so he compares the church, but then you can also compare the society we're in, our nation as well, to the human body. And he says, when one part of that body suffers, then all parts suffer with it. And he says the weakest parts of the body are actually the most indispensable, and that we should have equal concern for one another. So literally, Dr. King's kind of famous words, that injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere, is a remix of the Apostle Paul's letter to the church in Corinth. And when I was thinking about the AIDS crisis, as you know, Emira, a crisis that was devastating Southern Africa in particular, and yet, the world was sitting on antiretroviral therapy that could save millions of lives, but the cost of those medicines was far out of the reach of most of the people in Southern Africa at the time. And in the early stages of the epidemic, the United States was providing very little leadership. And it wasn't until there was a massive movement of faith leaders and doctors and gay rights activists and so many others that created a kind of firestorm, if you will, that ultimately inspired President Bush to create the Presidential Emergency AIDS Plan. And even before that, helped inspire Congress to create the Global Fund to fight AIDS, and malaria. But the title of my sermon was HIV, Healing the International Village. And I basically made the argument that, well, yes, HIV is an acronym that stands for the Human Immunodeficiency Virus. That's what we understand it scientifically. But if we were to view the AIDS crisis through the lens of faith, using what we like to describe as our sanctified imagination, that acronym would have a very different definition. In my mind, God would see this as an opportunity, a responsibility for us to heal the international village, HIV. And I think the same is true about the COVID crisis. We have seen how the COVID crisis has been apocalyptic. It's revealed so much of the brokenness and inequality, particularly racial inequality, that existed before COVID. We can't go back to the broken old normal. We have to see this as an opportunity, a responsibility to create a radically more just, more equitable new normal, which includes greater access to healthcare. It includes, hopefully, us overcoming some of that selfish individualism that has so many people resisting wearing masks and resisting doing things that will both protect themselves and others, and hopefully, over time, embracing a greater commitment to the common good. So there's like so much more I could say there, but that's kind of the connection point, I think, between those two.
Powerful connection point. One of the things that I love about this book, Adam, is that you did not stray away from using the term white supremacist, right? A lot of folks, especially trying to, to have a conversation with mixed audiences, they have chosen different terms, but you went there, which I was just like, yeah, go Adam. But I wonder, and we're here in DC, in the midst of a conversation about statehood, where we all know, you all, right? And most of this room especially know that DC with statehood would mean, most likely, 2 black senators. So I wonder if you could talk about DC and the moment we're in DC, and also talk about this issue of white supremacy and how it pervades so much of our politics, our lives, our reality.
Not to be cliche, but I really think that DC in many respects is still a tale of two cities. And there is the kind of political DC, or at least DC that is very much connected to politics and to a certain extent to the World Bank and IMF and lobbying firms and all the rest. And then there's a DC that has been here much longer in many ways and is really just trying to survive. And ultimately to thrive, that's the ultimate goal. And so I think that on the one hand, I'm grateful that there's greater awareness about statehood, and I feel like we're closer than we've been in a very long time to actually building more and enough political pressure to see some real progress. As you kind of alluded to, unfortunately, Republicans, by and large, have embraced a strategy to try to derail the demographic changes that are happening in this country, and are seeing politics through a very zero-sum lens and kind of a winner-take-all lens. And so they are stonewalling any efforts to try to ensure that we no longer have representation without, or taxation without representation. And so it's going to be uphill climb, but I really see it as a core fight for democracy. It's a core fight for the rights and dignity of all people living in Greater Washington, D.C. And I think we need to make it a central part of our advocacy work going forward. I felt like it was very important to name white supremacy, partly because sometimes it gets kind of confused and conflated with other things. In my mind, white supremacy is literally the belief in a hierarchy of human value. And it is a belief that then has had profound implications in terms of who has been denied resources and opportunities and who has been granted them, who has been granted equal protection of the law and who is presumed guilty rather than innocent. And it is a kind of umbilical cord that continues to suffocate the promise and potential of American democracy and of our country as a whole. I'll just really quickly, I want to read one little quick section, which I was going to read earlier, but now that you've reminded me, I want to quickly share this. So in the book, there's a chapter called Pluribus Una, out of many one, which used to be the motto of the United States before it was changed in 1956 to "In God We Trust." So in this chapter I write, underlying our depolarization is a growing recognition that within a few decades, white people will constitute a minority of the country's population. This inevitable demographic shift has been a source of great trepidation, anxiety, and fear among many white Americans, even as it serves as a source of hope and pride for many others, particularly people of color. If the nation does not embrace this trend, the fault lines of race and color will continue to pull us apart. And as long as America is defined by the normalization of whiteness and the primacy of white culture and people, we will remain stuck in a vicious cycle of crippling division and acrimony. Now, my wife is from Jamaica originally, born in Montego Bay, and I consider myself an honorary Jamaican.
He likes your chicken, right?
I hope my in-laws are watching right now. But one of the things that I really love about what Jamaica did in 1962 when they got their independence from Great Britain is they added a word to the pluribus unum. Their motto is out of many, one people. And I think that's really powerful and has something to teach us as a country. We have to, in my opinion, build a greater sense of shared memory, of shared hopes and aspirations, and shared values. Not to say that we'll ever get a point where we all share those exactly alike, but I feel like it's important that we have a sense of peoplehood, not a sense of nationalism. And I really very much push back against that. And the whole chapter focuses on redemptive patriotism, where I really take on the dangers of nationalism, but more as a way to celebrate the ideals that ultimately we want to cherish as a country, and we ultimately want to realize as a country. And so this sense of peoplehood, I think, is an important thing to embrace, and you can learn more about it particularly in this chapter.
I just want to say amen. That's powerful. Beautiful. So Adam, I was just moved by the forward of the book. From, I just feel like John Lewis is just an icon and just an incredible part of what inspires so many of us now. And first of all, I'd love to know how you managed with the timing of his passing to get this, which I think probably is another book to be written. But just in terms of his legacy, of that good chunk, and how you carry that out in so much of what you do, both the prophetic voice and the radical activist voice, and you combine them all in a really creative, beautiful fashion. So speak a little bit about continuing that legacy of the good chunk.
Yeah. So John Lewis has been a hero of mine, really since I started to read about the civil rights movement, probably when I was in middle school. And, it's still humbling and surreal that, one, I got to know him later in my career. He wrote the afterword for my first book, No Life of Hope. And, not to say that I got to know him really well, but just had a number of interactions where I just saw just how funny he is, but also just how tireless his commitment has been to the beloved community. And, it kind of is a little crazy to think that back when I realized that my generation inherited the unfinished business of rights movement, I never could have imagined that part of that ongoing work would have to be to fight for the right to vote. 55 years after the passage of the Voting Rights Act, we would be in a situation where 400 bills have been proposed in 48 states, further restricting the right to vote. And so we know that the right to vote has been contested since the beginning, but John Lewis's ongoing work that he sacrificed his life for is still ours to do. So when my publisher asked me who I wanted to write for, I immediately thought of John Lewis. It was like, who embodies the beloved community more than John Lewis? And I knew that he was sick. I didn't know how sick he was. And I reached out to his chief of staff, the former chief of staff, Michael Collins, a friend, and was like, I know this is a long shot, but is there any chance that John Lewis might be willing to write forward? And he was like, he is really sick. I think at that point he was working in hospice. And he said, I can't guarantee anything, but we'll try. And I pretty much just let it go. I just assumed it hadn't happened. I started coming up with my longer list of additional people that I could ask. And after John Lewis went on to glory, literally the next day I got a text from Michael saying that he had approved the forward for his passing. And I don't know exactly which day. I have to imagine it probably was like the last week or so of his life. And the fact that he took the time to do that is just like unbelievable. It's so humbling. Very good tears. So yes, thank you, John Lewis. I believe that he's leaning over the balcony at heaven, and he's probably pretty happy about this conversation.
And we know there are many of you in this room that are carrying on the legacy and fighting for voting rights, so we look forward to your questions and comments and really sharing your stories as well. Thank you, Adam. I'm glad I know time is against us, but and we want to open up for more of your questions. I know one of your Beatitudes is around climate justice and environmental justice, so I wanted to just give a bit of a space for you and talk a bit about why that's important and delve into maybe that one of the 6 Beatitudes a little bit further.
Yeah, so I lose sleep over the world that my sons are going to inherit. And we're starting to see those impacts now. Wildfires, California, record hurricanes, they're impacting the Gulf Coast and now on the East Coast. And so climate change is not theoretical. It's literally in front of us. And there's been kind of this debate, at least within the Christian circles, if you will, where I think there's been some really distorted theology that has emphasized dominion. If you look at the first Genesis story, there is this sense, or at least you can kind of warp it to have the sense that we don't have to care about the earth because we are called by God to control it. If you look a little further in Genesis, there's another Genesis story that talks about how we are called to be good stewards of the earth, to be caretakers of the earth. I actually think that is much more in line with God's heart and God's intention for all of us. And so, one, just from a very kind of macro perspective, we really need to change our mindset. And then from a policy perspective, we have to find a way to break our addiction to carbon, to get us on a zero carbon trajectory. We probably have about 10 years to get that money back, to get onto a much better trajectory. And gosh, won't spell out all the different policy details that are required. But I really think it requires personal change. It requires corporate sector to significantly lead as well, and it requires policy transformation. Fortunately, there are pieces of that in the infrastructure bill and in the kind of reconciliation package. It's not nearly enough, but if we don't get those things across the finish line, I think we are really going to be hard pressed to get us on the right track.
Yes, well said. I wish we had an hour just on that one. Yeah, well said. I know there are questions. I think there are questions from people in the room as well as from those joining us virtually. So we will open it up to see what are you all thinking, feeling? How are you absorbing this powerful book and what you've heard today? So maybe we'll start with those in the room and then go to those joining virtually to give you a chance to share. What are your questions, comments, concerns? Thrills as we celebrate the joy of a more perfect union and all that we're going to do to build that beloved community. So I think we will have a microphone. Could we just see if there are any, just a quick show of hands, any burning questions in the room?
Well, this is not shy.
Busboys crowds are never shy. So there are two questions there. You're okay. Hello?
Yes. Ooh, that one's loud.
And please just introduce yourself, say how you
The Constance Newman, I didn't mean to be the first question there. You exude optimism, very positive, and that's so wonderful, but how do you deal with those who've given up? Because sometimes people don't want to hear cheer. They can't take it. How, in what way can you communicate what you know and how you feel and bring about change with those people who have given up?
Thank you. Stephen, that's a great question. And I'll kind of answer it in two different ways. So with my Reverend hat on, I certainly believe in the power of hope. And it's kind of in our job description, if you will. We really believe in the cross and believe in the resurrection. We've got to believe in hope, and ultimately that God can make all things new, that we have ultimately the victory already. That being said, I think that there's a critical need to, one, be able to better communicate concrete examples of where the beloved communities are already being realized in all kinds of beautiful ways. I don't typically grab headlines. I'm grateful. One of my friends, Laura, is here, who's a Kennedy School alum with me, and she helped found an organization here in DC called Kindred. It is doing amazing work with the public school system, helping to inspire parents to build relationships with each other across racial and socioeconomic differences so that they can ultimately work together to transform their schools and make them more equitable. It is amazing work. And I bet you the majority of people in DC may not know about it. We're going to try to change that more. But there's so many examples like that in the book. That's kind of one piece. The other is that I think we have to help people understand that our history is one of progress and regress. And that, yes, the arc of the moral universe bends toward justice, but it can be a very long, arduous journey along that path, right? And so I'm not in any way trying to sugarcoat that this is going to be easy, or that it's not going to require sacrifice, or that it's not going to require struggle. And there are many moments, and my wife can attest to this, where I get fed up and I get very frustrated. I mean, I've gone through waves of this during the midst of the pandemic, particularly around the issue of mask wearing. I can't understand why wearing a piece of cloth on your mouth is somehow a huge violation of the human rights, particularly when it is so essential for public health. I actually wrote an article when I was fed up that said, for God's sake, wear a damn mask. Yes, I mean, there are going to be moments when we're frustrated, but I think that as we support each other and we're in a community with each other, we know when one person is kind of down and out, and we can provide that extra support and lifeline to them. We know when we've kind of hit our limit and we might need to step back a little bit. So it's a combination of those things that I think we need.
Wow, so and I know there were a few more hands. I'm going to try to alternate between those who are joining us virtually and those who are in the room, if that's okay. And Adam, we might double up on these questions. Quite a few coming in here. So one of the, I'm sorry we don't have the names of the people, but we just welcome you all into the space and we thank you for offering your questions and comments. And so one of the comments we've received is, how have you found ways to spread love in the face of white hostility in response to your powerful commentary on white supremacy? I'll just double them up. A second one. What have you found to be the most effective when trying to reach out and connect with others that have vastly differing views, despite having the same faith?
Great question. So thank you for those who posed that. So I should have emphasized earlier that what Dr. King described as a community of agape love is at the heart of the beloved community, vision and journey. What he means by agape is a love that is resilient, but also selfless. It is a love that doesn't otherize, doesn't demonize others, but tries to see the humanity and divinity within them. And I fall short of this, but that's what I try to do. I really believe in the power of love. And there's certainly ways in which I get discouraged, and I wonder whether I or others can be capable of convincing some folks to maybe see things differently. But ultimately, I come back to love. So I think it is an ethic that ultimately has the power to make your enemy into your friend. Mm-hmm. In terms of the second question, remind me.
Okay, so the second question is people of the same faiths.
Oh, right. So one of the things is that it's important to try to start a conversation from a shared love of our faith. We may define it very differently. We probably have a very even different, in some cases, understanding who Jesus was and what it means to follow Jesus. But at least in theory, we share in the Christian tradition a love for Jesus. So that can be a pretty powerful starting point. Then I think it's really important, even if you're not just in a Christian context, start with some shared values. Start with the things that you care about for your family and your community. And again, it won't always be the same. Oftentimes it won't be. But you'll be surprised how much shared kind of hopes and dreams you have with people that might be very different than you, ideologically or politically or otherwise. I think too often we start either from our identity or we start from our ideological perspective and party affiliation, particularly now. And once you do that, it's very hard to then go back and find that common ground based on shared values and shared hopes and aspirations. So we got to flip the script. let's start from the shared values, then we can move on to how do you apply those values to some of the most challenging issues facing us.
Beautiful, thank you. Now we come to the room. And, yeah, I see Mark Harrison in the red shirt, and our sister.
The other person answered my question.
Oh, right. Okay, wonderful. Go ahead.
I don't need a microphone, never had. I'm curious, my name is Zena. I'm curious, Adam, about your notion of reconciliation as a high bar and a high goal. And what I know of reconciliation, and I don't have the Desmond Tutu quote in front of me, but I remember Archbishop Tutu saying it's costly. And it is based on forgiveness. Forgiveness is based on repentance. You can't repent until you know what you're repenting for. So repentance, forgiveness, reconciliation as a build-up to reconciliation. How do we do that with systems? I get the work of individuals, but the reconciliation is not, I think, only going to be between individuals.
You want to take one more? Or do you...
One more question.
Okay.
Judy, do you have anything else?
No, I actually I had something very similar to her.
Okay.
Adam, when a politician says this is not who we are, what is your response? Who are we as Americans?
Mark Leslie, cut to the chase. All right, so starting with Reverend Zena's question, which I think you partially answered in the way that you constructed it, but let me build on what you said. I agree with you that real, true, lasting reconciliation has to start with repentance. We have to know what we're forgiving someone for, let alone what we're making amends for. And repentance, and I certainly learned this a lot from Jim Wallace, isn't just feeling sorry about something. It is literally about turning in another direction and moving in a different direction that is much more about the restoration of right relationship. And so I worry and I fear that particularly within the white Christian church, but not just there, we have privatized reconciliation. We have made it almost entirely about interpersonal, right? And that is important, but that is not nearly enough. And so we then are blind to the ways in which reconciliation is needed in systems and structures that continue to harm and perpetuate injustice. And I think that is one of the biggest challenges in the context of building a beloved community. It ties into what I said earlier about being blind to or being in denial about our history. We're actually backtracking. I mean, it's crazy to me. We have 12 states in this union that have passed bills that ban teachers from teaching about the fullness of our history, including some of the ugly parts, and banning them from discussing or addressing systemic racism. All because this kind of academic theory of critical race theory has been made into this boogeyman, right? And so, lots of ways we're going backwards. But then, there's a chapter where, I think it's in the Include or Student chapter, I describe my experience first witnessing what happened after the horrific massacre of the Emmanuel Nine at Mother Emanuel Church in South Carolina. And when some of the survivors of those family members forgave the culprit, the perpetrator of that heinous crime, it went viral because the whole story was on forgiveness. And it was a beautiful moment, right? But what wasn't then told is, what does right relationship look like? What does it mean to restore that, not just in this particular situation, but in the broader context of South Carolina or Charleston, let alone for our entire nation? And I feel like time and time again, we go to the personal and not the broader systemic. And I understand why we do it, but we've got to be the ones that help to inspire people and in some cases cajole them to understand that, no, this is a systemic issue. Last thing I'll say really quickly on this is that, so often we mistranslate the word for righteousness, as you know, Reverend Zena, in the Bible, to tzedakah. And we make it about piety, we make it about the individual. When
the Bible is clear that it's actually about communal righteousness. It's about how we live our lives together. And that's just one example of many that I can point to. So we also just need to be better at teaching our Bible and what our teachings actually mean. On the question about, yeah, Mark. So who are we? I mean, we are a country that has been riddled with division and with falling woefully short of the ideals that ultimately make this country amazing. I refuse to use the word great for some obvious reasons. And we're a country that is continually striving. And again, the emphasis of more perfect union is not on somehow believing we've arrived, but it is in the constant striving of trying to become more perfect. And to me, that is kind of the opportunity. That is the brilliance of what America can be. And my wife and I didn't tell this part of the story, but walked with me back the morning after the election, and my wife and I got in one of the most bitter arguments we've had in our marriage. And literally, she was convinced that we were moving to Canada. We got those passports, we were holding on to them. My wife is also a Canadian citizen. She just became an American citizen a month and a half ago, so celebrate that. But part of it was, do we believe enough in the capacity for America to change, where we can feel like our two black sons are going to be safe and are going to be seen for who they are and be given the opportunity to realize their full potential? And you know how that story ended. We stayed. And I kind of felt like if we're going to stay, I in particular, but we kind of have to be all into this. And that's part of what I hope to do or try to do in my work as Sojourners, but also beyond. And I think that we can't afford to be on the sidelines of this thing. We've got to be willing to fight and to push and to try to ensure that we can build a loving community together.
Awesome. Well, thank you for not moving to Canada, sir. The book probably still would have come, but it would have been a different slant, I would imagine. But we're going to have a couple more questions. We'll go back to those who are joining virtually. And then we'll try to come to wrap up our conversation. So Adam, what would you say is the defining difference between dangerous nationalism versus healing peoplehood? That's one. And there's one more I'd like to try. What would you say is our biggest fight this decade in terms of social justice and human rights with your spiritual background in mind?
So, dangerous nationalism is wrapped in the belief that, well, one, it's often wrapped in a lot of hatred and fear. And there's kind of a version of it that is kind of tied into what's called Christian nationalism, which is this belief that the kind of flag and the cross are almost one and the same, and that God has kind of blessed America to essentially lead in all kinds of ways. But it really is this kind of co-optation of faith under the flag. And instead of putting God above the flag, it's almost like God comes below it. There's also just a broader form of nationalism that is so much about who really is the true American and who's entitled to the full benefits and privileges of being American. And I think this kind of narrative among some of wanting to take their country back ties into this kind of really pernicious form of nationalism that showed up on January 6th. And that's literally what many of them were chanting. And they're using and perverting the cross and other Christian symbols to justify their insurrectionist cause. And so contrast that to healing peoplehood. And to me, healing peoplehood is not about blood and soil. It is about the richness of our diversity, and then finding in that strength, and finding in that shared common purpose, and ultimately a commitment to try to embrace and live out the true ideals that, again, I think have the potential to make America great, or using a different word, wonderful, beautiful, what have you, right? The promise of liberty and justice for all. And so there's more in the chapter on redemptive patriotism that I think kind of helps answer that question, but that would be my initial answer. And what is the most important social justice issue in the next 10 years? I mean, that is a tough one. I mean, I think as we talked about before, the climate crisis poses such an existential crisis to all of us that literally is going to change everything. So because it has such a ripple effect on everything else, poverty and you name it, I would probably put that as number one. But I think in the kind of short term, leading up to that 10-year question, is we've got to save our democracy. Like it literally is under assault right now. And, you know, in some ways we kind of dodged a bullet in terms of the 2020 elections actually being recognized and ultimately seeing Trump come out of office or pushed out of office. But we know the forces of Trumpism have not gone away. We know that there are states, including Georgia, that have now changed the law to make it easier for now partisan election officials to overturn election results. And we know that the right to vote is being assaulted around the country. So in my mind, the most important thing that we can do in the next 6 months is work together tirelessly to pass the John Lewis Voting Advancement Act and the Freedom to Vote Act, which is kind of a new version of the For the People Act. And so those are really, really important, and it's going to be a huge uphill climb. And ultimately, I think it's going to require, like grace or miracle of God, convincing Joe Manchin and Kristen Sinema, both senators, that if you can't make an argument morally to make a carve out of the filibuster to save our democracy, then there is no other reason that you can do it for, right? And so, unfortunately, because of the politics, that's probably what's going to be required to ultimately get us across the finish line of those two bills. And many of us are working to try to do just that. And so, I hope you will join us.
Thank you so much for those answers. And I guess, you know, Adam, how do people join you? Some may already be connected to Sojourners, some may not. And we know there are many in this room that have followed the Poor People's Campaign and a number of other powerful witnesses, right, to the movement we're in. So please share with us, what should people do to be in the right trouble, in the good trouble? And what would be your kind of go-to places for anyone interested and those in their own opportunities to engage further?
Yeah, well, certainly not to be self-serving, but soja.net, definitely a place to go. So grateful that so many of my colleagues are here. Sandy Obaye, who's also in the book, particularly in a number of chapters. Thank you, Lori, who's a director of communication, and Elizabeth, and Jessica, and oh, Terrence, you're hiding back there. There he is, Reverend Terrence McKinley, speaking of voting rights. And Rob, our CEO. In addition to that, I mean, there are, as I said before, glimpses of the beloved community all throughout the book. Learn about Kindred. Talk to Laura. She's literally here in the back who found that
Laura,
organization.
can you raise your hand? Let people see you. Or stand up. There you go.
The Poor People's Campaign is literally one of my examples of a glimpse of the beloved community when I talk about approaching independence and I talk about the continuation of the vision of Dr. King. And so I don't have time in this moment to list all those organizations, but there's a lot that are featured in the book. And let me just end into this. One of my hopes for this book was that it could help catalyze an ongoing revolution of building the beloved community. And I want everyone to be a part of shaping what that vision looks like. It is incomplete if it doesn't have you in it. The beloved community is about all of us, right? And we're not going to get there unless we are able to help scale up all of these amazing, inspiring initiatives out there that are helping us to achieve a more perfect union.
Well, with that, we've come to the end of our time. We thank those who have joined us virtually. We thank everyone in the room. We thank the awesome Busboys and Poets staff and the servers and all who are there to and thank those of you who are in the book for your courage, your boldness, your creativity, and your work. And Adam, we thank you. Continued strength, huh? You know, those amazing words, we are the ones we've been waiting for. Adam does that and inspires that. And so we thank you for carrying forward Jim Jordan's message to us all this time. Thank you. their book, now's the time to get it.
Now's the time to get it. If you're watching us from home, tuning in, thank you so much. And thank you to everyone who came out in person today. Love seeing your smiling faces. For those who were eating and drinking, we are wearing masks here in this space. Woo. And I just want to go ahead and say, I hope this made you think. With a dash of hope and optimism, we're seeing folks like Adam doing the work in a variety of ways. We know that that work is being done every day, not only in Congress, but in various amounts of halls in schools, churches, libraries, everywhere across the country. And it's been an honor being able to host Adam here tonight because, I don't know, the whole other community, we've been talking about it for so long, and I'm hoping as we go through week by week, we get closer. And so, books have always been at the forefront of revolution and change, and we here at Busboys hope to be in line with that step by step. So, thank you all so much. Have a good evening. And if you would like to purchase a signed copy of the book, you can until 10 p.m. online. And then everyone else, you can buy one now. Thanks so much, you guys. Have a good night.